Hello, everyone that's joining. We're so happy to have you here today. So grateful for your passion and interest in Mary's Place and in this topic of how systemic racism impacts family homelessness. We're going to get started in just a couple minutes as others join, but thank you for being here. Wow, we have lots of folks joining us. Thank you for being here. We're excited to see you today. We've got some new friends, some old friends. We've got some people from our site selection committee I see joining us. You are awesome and amazing. From our communications committee. Oh my goodness, so many great people. Thank you for joining us. A lot of volunteers on the line. We've got some new friends. So my goodness, thank you. We're going to get started in just about another minute or two. We are grateful for your passion and interest in Mary's Place, and most importantly, grateful for your passion to learn more about how systemic racism really impacts family homelessness. Thank you, thank you, thank you for joining us. Hope you are all doing well. The sun is here, gonna have a great weekend. We've got Juneteenth to celebrate. So much good going on. We'll wait one more minute and get started. We have so much to share today. I'm going to say that site selection team really came out to support today. And I see a lot of Mary's Place staff joining us too. Thank you all. So grateful to have incredible, supportive, passionate, caring, loving, smart, intelligent team members. And I'm so grateful you get to meet some of our panelists today too, who are in fact our Mary's Place staff, who champion and lead this work with our families every day. So grateful. All right, I think we're about ready to get started here. Let's dive right in. I just want to say welcome. Thank you for being you and for being here with us today. I'm Marty, the director of Mary's Place, and grateful and thankful to be here with you. Juneteenth is just a few days away, and we want to acknowledge that holiday with this Lunch and Learn and the topic of on the historical and disproportionate impacts of systemic racism on homelessness and the steps that we're taking right here at Mary's Place to address those impacts. But before we dive in, I'd like to begin together by acknowledging the land on which we stand. We are on the traditional home of the Coast Salish people, specifically the traditional home of the Duwamish, the Snohomish, and Suquamish. And although they're not here, they are here today. They are still not recognized by the federal government. And I want to offer gratitude to all of our elders and all other Coast Salish people, past, present, and future, who have made it possible for us to live and work and love in this community. And I want to invite each of you to seek authentic relationships with our Indigenous neighbors and to continue to learn about the present and past colonial impacts and move beyond just acknowledging those to acting. For those of you that are new with us, I just want to give you a little bit of background on Mary's Place. We began more than 20 years ago as a day center for women experiencing homelessness in downtown Seattle, which our day center still exists. Right there at 9th and Stewart. It is the heart of Mary's Place. We continue to serve about 100 women each day. And at that day center, women are there meeting their basic needs. They have showers, laundry, they have access to dry, warm clothing, along with 2 nutritious meals. And then most importantly, they have resources for housing, employment, and wellness. really to meet the needs that they identify that they have. We can come alongside them at that day center. And then we opened our first overnight shelter, knowing that there was a lack of shelter for women and children. And we did that in 2012. And we've continued to develop our emergency shelter program to address the growing needs in our community. And not long after we opened that first shelter for women and children, we knew we needed to keep families together. We had to address their housing needs together. And so we opened a shelter to include moms and dads together with their children. And then we noted single dads outside with their children. So we invited them in too. And then we opened shelters for extended family, knowing that there were grandmas and grandpas and aunties and family members all living together, and we wanted to create space for them. And then families were staying outside because they had pets and they didn't want to sacrifice their pets in order to come inside. So we invited the pets inside too. And we also recognized that there were families who were sleeping outside who had lost everything, caring for their sick child. And that was the beginning of our Popsicle Place program. But before COVID, we provided emergency shelter and meals together with resources for housing and employment and wellness for about 800 moms, dads, and kids each night. But last spring, unfortunately, we had to close 4 smaller shelters to keep our guests and staff safe, a process of de-intensifying our shelter to create that social distancing that we needed so desperately. So we currently have 500, 500 beds in 5 shelters across King County. We are working to add back that much needed capacity as we prepare for families that will face homelessness as the state evictiontorium ends at the end of this month on June 30th. Unfortunately, we know that the majority of those families seeking our services will be Black, Indigenous, and people of color who are significantly much more likely to experience homelessness. You may or may not know in King County, only 6% of people identify as Black and 0.9% as Native American. And yet 40% of the families that we serve at Mary's Place identify as Black and 2% as Native American. And yet nearly 80% of Mary's Place families identify as Black, Indigenous, or people of color. The disproportionality is staggering. And we cannot address homelessness without first addressing the underlying structural and historical racism in our systems of housing, in healthcare, in education, in our legal system, in our child welfare system, and so many more. You know, there is a report issued back in March of 2018 by the Center for Social Innovation that opened with this paragraph. People of color are dramatically more likely than white people to experience homelessness in the United States. This is no accident. It is the result of centuries of structural racism that have excluded historically oppressed people, particularly Black and Native Americans, from equal access to housing, to community supports, and opportunities for economic mobility. Today, our amazing panel will share more about those inequities, how they impact homelessness rates, how they impact our families, and how we're attempting to address those inequities here at Mary's Place in our larger community. So today, I get the pleasure of introducing our amazing staff that will be sharing with you today a little bit more about the work they do. So as we get started, I first want to introduce Ryan Disch-Guzman, who is our Mobile Outreach and Diversion Director. You can give him some snaps. Next, Alyson Moon is our Mary's Place Director of Community Impact. Give her some snaps too. And I'm sorry to share that Natalie Lent from the Chief External Affairs Officer at Child Care Resources, who is an amazing partner of ours and one of our valued partners in this work, was going to join us today, but had a family emergency come up and had to fly home to take care of that. But fortunately, our amazing and awesome Senior Site Director, Arlene Hampton, you can give her some snaps, has agreed to step in. And I want to say thank you, Arlene. Arlene has a long history of working with our families in all aspects of their journey and can share the on-the-ground impacts, that frontline stories of the issues we will be discussing today. So thank you, panel. So you've heard enough from me. Let's get started. And Ryan, I'd like to start with you. I know you've done a lot of work on the historical systems of oppression that limit economic opportunity and sustain the wealth gap. That exacerbates really the impact of our region's affordable housing crisis. First, can you briefly introduce yourself? And then can you share some of the policies and actions that created our current condition of disproportionality?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Marty. I'm Ryan Disch-Guzman. I am the Outreach and Diversion Director here at Mary's Place. So I help oversee our programming with our unsheltered families. I'm going to go through a brief history lesson, so close to 100 years in 5 minutes, so bear with me. But I'm going to talk about the history of redlining and some of the root causes of housing crisis here in Seattle. So I want to begin with talking about an event that happened in July in 1923 that not many people here in Washington know about. And that was a Ku Klux Klan rally where 50,000 Seattleites attended. And to give you scale of that, that's more people than could fit into Safeco Field. We often talk about Jim Crow as it belonging in the South, but there was also Jim Crow policies and segregation that happened in the North, that happened right here in Seattle, that happened in the 20th century. These weren't just rallies, these were sessions that taught white people in this city and this region how to create what we call racially restrictive covenants. These covenants were used to not only bar people of color from being able to own housing in most neighborhoods in Seattle and cities in King County, but also barred their movements. They weren't allowed to congregate in these neighborhoods. In fact, the only neighborhood that they were allowed to be free within was the Central District in Seattle. These racially restricted covenants created what were called, and in some communities still exist to this day, as sundown towns, which were essentially unsafe neighborhoods for people of color to be in. In 1964, these racially restrictive covenants became illegal with the Civil Rights Act. However, what happened after that is what we call redlining. And what happened in this region, and specifically Seattle, is redlining was a tactic of making mortgage loans far more affordable for white communities than they were for Black and Brown communities. And in Seattle, in communities throughout the US, they used census figures, but in Seattle specifically, they used the racial restrictive lines that were created to continue that practice of making it incredibly difficult for specifically Black people living in Seattle from owning housing. And again, the Central District became one of the only spaces where Black people could collect wealth. With that, as time went on, and we became, yes, more desegregated, as economic influences occur, like have happened here. If you remember the recession in 2008, they disproportionately affect Black families because Black families were restricted from owning housing. So when economic situation, recession, like in 2008 happens, it disproportionately affects Black families. And the neighborhoods in South King County, and specifically in the Central District, had a more difficult time recovering from the 2008-2009 recession than white families did. You can see how Black families never fully recovered. And as a result of that, school closures happened. The Yesler housing development was closed, and Black families were forced to move south. And we see these disproportionate impacts on housing to this day. So there's a direct line from this Klan rally that happens in 1923 and the restrictions that were placed on Black families and the current crisis that we have in housing. So it might be this 100-year history, but it all connects, and it hasn't been fully resolved or healed yet. And it's important to know when we're talking about family homelessness and crises that specifically Black families face in terms of housing.
Wow, such good information. Thank you, Ryan, for all of that information, and that we know some practices of redlining are still prevalent today. So I want to say, if you have questions for Ryan, if you can please type those into the Q&A. You'll find that little tab at the bottom of your screen. So, and we will answer those at the end of our presentation. So you'll be able to ask all the panelists questions. Our next panelist is Alyson Moon. Hello, Alyson. Can you introduce yourself and talk about the work the Mary's Place team is doing to use data to drive decisions and to improve how our programs and services are delivered to really be more inclusive and to reduce disparities in outcomes?
Absolutely. So hello, everyone. My name is Alyson. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Director of Community Impact for Mary's Place, where I've been for about the past 9 years. So as an organization that's serving people and families experiencing homelessness, we have a direct and a significant responsibility to make sure that we at Mary's Place, through our programs and our services, are not also having a disparate impact on people based on their race or ethnicity. So it's really critical and paramount that we don't exacerbate or perpetuate the disparity that exists in the overall system, the one that Marty spoke to when she shared those numbers with you. And so really the first step is to look at the impact of our programs through a race equity lens through data. So collecting, analyzing, and acting on our data. Over the past several years, we've really expanded the way that we use our data. And one thing that we do is we utilize the practice of disaggregating our data by race so that we can see how different groups of people are experiencing our services and determine if there are any differences in outcomes for different groups. And this is important because it really lets us see if there's any disparity in impact. So when we look at aggregated data, we're not able to see a nuanced picture. So for example, we might look at our aggregated data and see a high exit rate from our programs to permanent housing overall, which is a positive overall outcome. But then if we disaggregate our data, we might see that exits to permanent housing by our white guests is really what's driving up the average. If we dig in, we might see that our Black guests are experiencing a lower rate of exit to permanent housing despite making up the majority of our shelter population, which is not the case with our data, but it could be, right? It's an example. And without the disaggregation, we might assume that we're doing well for all of our guests and keep moving forward without pause. So it really is the disaggregation that allows us to understand what's truly happening and begin the process to really examine what do we need to adjust so we can achieve equitable outcomes. So I want to share just like one specific example of this. Ryan's team, so our Mary's Place outreach team, disaggregated their data and they looked at all of their various program outcomes broken down by race. So for the most part, they saw equitable outcomes across all of the racial groups, but there was one exception, and that was related to displacement. So when the data was broken down, they found that Black families were leaving their community of support or being displaced at a higher rate than white families. So in other words, the white families we were serving ended up finding housing in their home community, while the Black families we were serving ended up leaving their home communities to access housing in a new community. So knowing this, because our data, it showed up in our data, the team started to ask, why is this happening? And through the process of discussion, they discovered that the outcome was being impacted by the questions that our staff were asking our clients. So for our white clients, staff were asking them where they wanted to live, and then they were supporting that goal. But for our Black clients, staff were instead asking where they could afford to live. So it was really our practice that was resulting in different outcomes for different families. So to address the challenge, the team adopted new language, and now Ryan's team really uses the same language and asks families to, where is your community of support? Where is that located? And then the team supports families to transition to housing in that community. This disparity would not have been known, and we couldn't have developed this solution had we not disaggregated our data, reviewed it as a team, and then really had thoughtful conversation about what is this data telling us. I will say that in addition, Ryan's team is interested in staying accountable to this. And so they look at this data monthly, broken down by race and geography, to continue to hold themselves accountable to equity as it relates to displacement. So that's just one example of the way that we've used our data to drive towards equity.
Awesome. Thank you, Alyson, for that detailed information about our data and our incredible data team and the work that we continually do to reassess and evaluate and create change, and how we collect that data is critically important. So if you have questions for Alyson, please put those in the Q&A button down below. She'll be happy to answer those. There's a lot that goes into our data collection, so we know you have more questions, so please don't be shy and ask those. And I want to say, Arlene, thank you again for joining us on this panel today. You're working with our families in shelter every day. Can you take some time and share some of those stories about the barriers that our families of color in particularly are facing that brings them into shelter and then really hampers their search for housing?
Right, sure, Marty. Thank you. My name is Arlene Hampton. I'm a senior site director here at Mary's Place. I oversee the Burien site as well as help oversee other sites. And I'm also part of the executive leadership team. When we talk about, as Ryan mentioned, the historical oppression, as Alyson mentioned about the data and the data showing a very telling story about disproportionality, those lead us to those different barriers that we know still exist and continue to exist as we see families come into shelter. We can't talk about homelessness, we can't just talk about the racism that we see that's embedded in the systems without talking about those other core barriers. We know that lack of employment, we know that there's discriminatory practices there, we see it happening in the lack of accessibility to healthcare, all of these different core barriers, we see how they feed into, once again, our families seeking shelter because of these core barriers, and we see our families as they're trying to come up with housing solutions be met with these different barriers. Again, it's not just our African-American families, but we see our families from other countries. We have a huge population here at Mary's Place, East African population that we also serve. We see our Indigenous and our Native. We see the challenges that we see them face each and every day as well. And they're going to look different depending on where they're from, depending on what community they're from. But what we do see that the common denominator is that those unfortunate discriminatory practices and barriers still continue to exist. With our families that are English as a second language, going to a resource and not being able to get information in their language. We see others going into communities where they're not able to access those much needed resources and services in those communities where they're seeking housing, which drives them to have to seek housing elsewhere. And oftentimes when they're looking in other areas, there's just simply not enough housing in those different areas. So we see, as Ryan mentioned, that history, we see that historical context, it would rear its ugly head in different forms and fashions. While we know, yes, redlining still happens to a certain extent, we know that we don't see it as much. But where we do see it as, we see it in the different stories. And that's what I want to talk about today, is just the different stories that our families face. And they're not always defined as the things that we mentioned today. Sometimes it's just simply a denial letter. Sometimes it's a don't get a call back. Oftentimes we hear families come to us and say, we tried to call, we didn't get an answer, or we met and we just simply didn't understand the process because it was done in a different language and there wasn't those services and support. So where we're able to come in and we're able to help provide that support, with our housing specialists, with our employment, our stability teams, to address these different barriers that continue to show up and make those connections. And we don't do this alone. We have some great, awesome, and amazing partnerships that we're able to work with individuals because we realize, as Alyson said, as we begin to look at the data and see where can we best meet those needs, we also realize we want to bring in our community partners to help meet those needs. We want to meet with those who specialize in those different areas. So we have informal partnerships with different organizations such as Chief Seattle Club, Mother Nation. We also work with amazing organizations such as RERA. We also work with the Muslim Housing and all sorts of different organizations that we know understand those unique needs that are there. They also understand those unique barriers that different communities of color, different individuals of color face when trying to look for housing. So through those partnerships, we're able to just address those unique barriers. We had one family that was able to connect with Chief Seattle Club, And not only were they able to address the different barriers, but again, address those root causes behind the homelessness, and they were able to do so in a way that also met those individual cultural needs at the same time, understanding their history, understanding their family dynamics in a very different way. And so they were able to get all of those things met, which once again played a role into addressing those different barriers. And what the result was, it was a great positive outcome. And we continue to seek, where else can we go to seek partnerships with other individuals in the community? You know, we realize we don't do this work alone. You know, as the saying says, it takes the village. And we're a part of that village. So we continue to go out in the community, and we go out and look at the different communities, go out into the communities of color and look at what organizations are best meeting those needs. And we talk to them, we partner with them to address the different barriers that we continue to see, which has had, once again, incredible outcomes. We see that our families of color, which is about 80% of color that we serve here at Mary's Place, we see them getting into housing and finding housing each and every week. Nothing excites me more to hear families say as I walk in the shelter, I got the keys, I got the keys. The story never gets old because I know the story behind it. I know what it took to get to where they are now. And it was some great collaboration with both our partners. It was some great work by our housing specialists and our team to address those different barriers. Thank you, Marty.
Yeah, awesome and amazing. Thank you, Arlene, for sharing all about our families and really what they face every day, how difficult and challenging this is to navigate homelessness. And inside these structures of systemic racism, we know we have to create change ahead. So if you have questions for Arlene, again, please put those in chat. We're going to be ready to answer those in a few minutes. Whether it goes to, if you don't know who it goes to, any question that you have, please list it there. And I just want to say thank you again to our panel and really to the entire Mary's Place team who have created and done so much work in here to be able to bring forward this thoughtful information about how the impacts of racism and white supremacy are embedded in our systems and have created and continued to generate overwhelming disproportionality in who is actually experiencing homelessness and who is actually accessing social services. So we know that this is an incredibly deep and complex subject, and we've obviously only scratched the surface today here, but so we are going to give you a list of resources. We'll make sure those get emailed to you. If you want to do some more homework and dig in deeper, we want to make sure that we offer those resources to you, and you can always reach out for more from Mary's Place. But right now, we really just want to get to your questions. I know we have a few coming in through the Q&A, and Katrina works on our development team, and she's going to lead this part, ask the questions, and the panelists will chime in for us.
Hi, yes, thanks, Marty, and thank all of you for joining today. I have one question to start off with. I think this one would be great, Alyson, if you would be able to talk more to it. What more do you think could be done by Mary's Place or system-wide in King County or Washington to reduce racial disparities?
Thanks, Katrina. It's a big question. Obviously, lots of things that could be done, but I'm gonna stick with one thing that for me kind of is the crux of it. So when thinking about what could be done, I think both systemically and internally at Mary's Place to reduce racial disparities, it really comes down to centering the voice of those who are most impacted. So our community is in the process of standing up a new King County Regional Homelessness Authority. And the theory of change for that King County Regional Homelessness Authority reads, just gonna read it here. If we create a homeless response system that centers customer voice, then we will be able to focus on meeting needs and eliminating inequities and homelessness for all. So it really comes down to, we have to center voices at all stages, really from program ideas to design to development, all the way through to evaluation. And I think that really is the most critical action that leads us towards more equitable outcomes and reduce racial disparities, both at a system level and at Mary's Place internally.
Thank you, Alyson. And Ryan, thank you so much for sharing about some of those, the historical systems of oppression coming in relation to redlining. Would you be able to talk a little more about generational wealth and gentrification and how those have contributed to what we're seeing today?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. I think, the easiest way for a family in this country to grow in social class and to gain financial stability is through ownership of property. That's why there's so much protection of laws around property. That's why so much of our whole system of credit is centered around property. And that's by design. And so when things like racially restrictive covenants or redlining occurs and they're biased based off of race or have racist intentions, it creates a giant wealth gap between white families and Black families, and that's one of the reasons we see that this huge disparity. And gentrification is kind of another is when we're talking about like how racially restrictive covenants lead to redlining. Redlining also leads to gentrification. And when something destabilizing like the 2008-2009 recession happens, what happens is those lines of redlining can expand. And Seattle is now a luxury housing market. So what happens is when those Black and brown families were forced to foreclose on their homes and lost their homes during that recession, those properties were then bought, and then that wealth was taken from the community and applied in different ways. Black families are, like I said before, Black families are still in this county are still recovering from the 2008-2009 recession. I know that's hard for people to believe, but if you look at nationally too of what's happened, the projections show that collective Black wealth for Black women will be zero in the next 5 years. It's going down, and so it's not a good trajectory, and it shows it as I was explaining before, it is that line, the inability to develop wealth, to develop that financial stability has caused a crisis.
Thanks, Ryan. I just wanted to add to that, Ryan. In addition to that, what we're doing at a shelter level is making sure that we're able to identify and address those things as guests are in shelter by having, once again, some of our partners come in and do things such as financial literacy classes. Also, again, partnering with different organizations such as the Seattle Urban League, who does offer the first-time home buyer, and looking at different programs that address ways that we can strategically look at how do we close in that wealth gap. What does that look like? We know that it takes more than a minimum wage to be able to afford housing anywhere in Seattle or in the vicinity. So what does that mean? Is it about job skills? And how do we look at ways that we can help individuals find out where to seek those different resources? So thank you.
Thank you both. And I have another question for Marty. What is Mary's Place view on the proposed ballot initiative, Compassion Seattle Charter Amendment?
Thank you. Super good question. I will say Mary's Place has not taken a position on the proposed charter amendment. The majority of families experiencing homelessness do not meet the criteria of chronic homelessness. So the charter amendment specifically calls out for some positive and needed investments, right, in shelter and behavioral health resources. But we have some concerns about funding and the implementation of what those would look like. There isn't a budget or a plan for funding those charter amendments or the requirements. And the funding that is required to be allocated is inadequate to meet the need. And it's unclear to us right now how this legislative prioritization will impact other city and county programs, namely, I will say, the new regional governance structure that's going into place. So for that reason, we have not taken a position on the charter amendment. Hope that answers your question.
Thank you. And I have another question. I think maybe Alyson, you might be able to speak to this. How can your community partners help in this area, either with Mary's Place or even outside Mary's Place? And this is someone asking on behalf of Nestle, who we have a great partnership with.
Great. I think there's a lot of opportunities. Arlene mentioned we have a lot of formal and informal partnerships with other social service organizations. So I would say if you all are a social service organization that is in this work or is a community partner, we would love to figure out how we can learn more from you, and then also work with you to get our guests connected to culturally specific and culturally appropriate services. I think as well, there is so much to learn. Ryan just scratched the surface of some of the history, like the very tiniest little scratch, right? So there's so much for everybody to learn and to grow in understanding. And so I think that community partners, either individually or having a commitment through your office or your team to learn more and to help educate each other is really a place that people can start. We also are really interested in addressing the root causes of homelessness. I would love nothing more than if I worked my way out of a job, right? Like if families weren't experiencing homelessness, that would be fantastic. But we know that there are so many root causes, and we've just touched on some of those today. So I think really, getting an understanding of root cause issues and then engaging in advocacy around changing those systems. If we don't adjust the systems that bring people to us in the first place, we'll continue to be in this place. And so I think there's opportunity for us to join together in some advocacy to really change some of those systems that are creating some of the challenges that have been identified.
Thank you, Alyson. And this next question, I think either perhaps Arlene or Ryan, you could speak to, but essentially, what is a typical housing situation for your clients? Does this look like an apartment in a subsidized building or in a non-subsidized apartment, a rental house? What's the type of housing that is most available in the Seattle area? And do we have personal contact with landlords and managers to know if they are open or not open to racial diversity?
Sure, I can answer that. Through our Landlord Liaison program that we have at Mary's Place, we're able to foster and develop those partnerships with different landlords, both private owners as well as apartment units, duplex, other different type of housing institutions, organizations, if you will. So we established that because we want, number one, let them know the unique needs of the population that we serve. And then we want to develop that relationship so that we're able to use it as a resource when working with those families. What that looks like from family to family, it varies. We serve, the average size family we serve is about 3, but we do have families come in the door that are 10 plus, in size. And so because of that, we work with the families to talk about what are your unique needs. Through our Popsicle Place program we have here that works with medically fragile children, there are even other unique needs. They need a ramp, they need to be able to access or make sure they have ADA accommodations in the unit. So we work with the families to help them come up with the individualized housing solution. And based on that, we look at what resources are out there in order to be able to meet those individual and unique needs. And that can look everything from apartment to a house. It all just depends on what that need is.
Yeah, I would also talk about how most of our families we do problem solve to get them into a safe permanent housing solution. But I also want to stress just how unaffordable it is for a single parent household who typically needs a 2-bedroom, which is what we typically see at Mary's Place, to afford the most affordable subsidized unit. Not Section 8, the subsidized unit in the city of Seattle. That person has to be making $21 an hour. So that's the most affordable, and that's not affordable. That's not minimum wage here. That shows how the affordability crisis is, and it's not getting more affordable. That's why it is such a crisis, and our team does such a good job of making sure families get somewhere safe, because we don't want to see them be in an unsafe situation again, but it is difficult.
I would also add in here, I know there was a question around like working with landlords, and I just want to acknowledge that there are some practices that property managers and landlords engage in that aren't overtly racist, but have racist impact. And so part of it for us also has been understanding those things and navigating those conversations with landlords. So for example, running background checks. On the surface, that's not an overtly racist practice. However, if we dig into it, if you think about people of color are more likely to be pulled over by the police. Once pulled over, are more likely to be arrested. Once arrested, more likely to be convicted. And once convicted, more likely to be have a harsher sentence. that results in people of color being more likely to have a criminal history. So when you are talking about properties running background checks, it actually is kind of a covertly racist practice that really has disparate impact on people of color. So I think part of it for us too is in working with landlords, like understanding that like not everything is this overt like surface level, and that we really have to understand and then navigate those conversations with landlords to help bring them along in that understanding as well.
Thank you all. This question I'll put to the group, perhaps Marty might be able to speak to it. What might be a big change action that the private sector, such as the real estate and development industry, could do to help with the housing challenges that Mary's Place residents face?
I think I'll toss that to the team. Do you guys have a big change action that you can think of that you want to share? I know we have lots. We talk about lots all the time, but what are some of our big dream change actions?
One of my big dreams is just an increase of affordable housing that is affordable at rates for people who are making 0 to 30%, or that are in the 0 to 30% area median income. So, you know, homelessness at the end of the day is a lack of affordable housing. So if you all are interested in building more affordable housing, that would be super awesome. Super dream big, but thought I'd throw it out.
I think too, we focus so much on in Seattle about build, which is important and an important part of building affordable housing, but also community housing, like housing that, you know, provides childcare, that provides, like Arlene was talking about, employment, these type of things that are inclusive and form community. Things like the Africtown project that is starting to be built, like things that are inclusive and build community, are vital and important to revitalizing communities like the Central District.
Yeah, mine would be the same as Ryan and Alyson's, and having that housing be in communities where they can have equal access to those much needed services, healthcare and employment, and being able to work at the local, not just the local grocery store, but looking at different ways of even ownership, you know, being able to get a brick and mortar in those communities and start their own business, and being in the community, having housing in those communities would be awesome.
See, our whole team dreams big. Everybody at Mary's Place knows how to dream big, and we're working towards those solutions. I will just add that families shouldn't have to lose their house in the first place, that prevention is key, and that we can keep people in their homes, and it is much less traumatic. We know that when children experience homelessness in their youth, they're much more likely to repeat that as an adult. So it's much more preventative and just preventing them from losing their home. It's preventing them from having to endure the trauma that they face through homelessness. So we have a lot more work to do there. We're just now scratching the surface on prevention, but getting long-term solutions in place to help families stay in their homes is key as well. So yeah, those are just a few. We could talk all day about dream big actions, but thanks for asking the question, Diane.
Thank you all. Next question for Ryan. How do Seattle's rules regarding single family zoning impact communities of color around housing? And what can we do to help?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question that kind of like ties into what I was talking about in terms of the history. Like for those aren't familiar, most of Seattle is zoned for like single family housing. So like only a single family can live in a house in that lot. And it really reduces the amount of people we can house in the city and build and develop. For instance, one fact that blows people away that I tell them all the time is, you know, Paris is a smaller city area-wise, yet it houses millions and millions more people. And it's all around zoning. And the thing about how it affects communities of color is the neighborhoods that have been allowed to big builder and not have that single family zoning restriction are communities of color. And that's because they have less of a say when those zonings change. And the same thing is true for the light rail. I mean, there's a reason why the light rail is above ground in communities of color and underground in other communities. When these rules come about, when any rules come about housing, there is a very apparent bias that comes about between communities of color and other communities in Seattle and in King County. So one thing I'd like to suggest is anytime you see these new zoning laws come up or changes, to notice who's being impacted the most, and that it should be impacted equitably, and that communities of color should have a voice in those changes that happen.
Great, thank you, Ryan. And our next, and it looks like last question for now at least. Do you need volunteer translators? And if so, what languages are most needed at this time?
I can answer that. We absolutely love our volunteers. Again, as I said before, it takes a village. And we have some amazing volunteers who come in and be able to provide that support, that needed support to our guests. So the answer to that question is absolutely yes, we do. How to access that, to find out about our volunteer opportunities or how to become a volunteer, you can go to our Mary's Place Seattle website and look on there, and you can click on becoming a volunteer, and someone will be in contact with you to take you through that process. Some of the language we see the most, as I mentioned before, around 80% of our guests here at shelter are, guests of color. We have a huge East African population that primarily speaks Amharic, Tigrinya. We also look for individuals who speak Spanish, but we will take any and all volunteers, whatever language, to just add you to our network. So yes, we welcome the community to come be a part of what I love to call the Mary's Place movement. And thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. And it looks like that are all the questions we have so far. I will let folks know that in just a minute, I will drop into the chat a list of some suggested resources that our amazing staff have come up with for you to further your education and impact after today's luncheon. This will include some resources on how to speak to children about racism, as I know that was a question we had previously, as well as some more history on restrictive covenants and redlining. So I will drop that into the chat in just a moment.
Well, I just want to thank you all and thank our panelists, right, for their wisdom and their insight, and really to each of you for choosing to join us today. You could have done many other things, but you chose to join and learn really about the impacts of systemic racism on families that are experiencing homelessness. And we are so grateful that you joined this discussion. If you have additional questions, we just want to say, feel free to reach out. If you'd like to talk to someone on our team, there's emails here. We'll put in other contact information for you. And there's lots of ways that you can support Mary's Place in this effort. We're beginning to welcome back volunteers into our shelters, in-person volunteers. As Arlene says, it takes a village, and we need our village in person, right? And so if you'd like to learn more about those opportunities, you can find that at our website at marysplaceseattle.org. And then you can always make a donation to support our work. And you can find that on our website at marysplaceseattle.org. And just as a number to keep in mind, it's about $35 for a family to stay in shelter per night. And of those funds, we could use to keep them in their housing as well. So please consider giving to Mary's Place to keep the love going, to keep people housed, to help them find other housing resources. And then keep out an eye for more information about Lunch and Learns. We do hope to do more of these and share more information about other aspects of the work we do together in partnership, and really to address and prevent family homelessness. So knowing that, you'll receive a survey from us today. I hope you'll take a few minutes. Let us know what you really thought about the presentation and how we can make this more effective for you and more useful for you. That's how we learn and grow and develop. So please share ideas of topics that you'd like to learn or learn more about. If there's more about systemic racism and how that shows up in our work and in this community, and you want to learn more about that, please add that. But most importantly, thank you for being here. Thank you for our Mary's Place team, who is the heartbeat of this work. And thank you to all of you who make this work possible day in and day out. We are grateful for you. Big hugs coming at you. It was so good to see all of you, meet new friends, see old friends, get reacquainted. Someday we're going to do that here on site and be able to give big hugs right back at you. So Take care, everyone. Have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you again for being you and for being here and joining us today. Woohoo, snaps for all of you.